Because it can feel like, almost as a candidate, you're thinking, am I not allowed to be good at my job? Can we not talk about a time when I crushed it? Because I have crushed it. And the fact that you're in the room in that loop at any of the big companies means you have got a successful career as a PM. So it feels a little uncomfortable that someone's jab at the times you didn't make it work. And you think, but look at those 3 launches that I did, or look at that amazing idea that I had. And the person's like, actually, could we tell me about another struggle or another failure? So there's a lot of psychology in there. And we'll talk maybe more about why companies use these questions and what they're looking for. It'd be good to get into that. But that's my origin story, if I can use that phrase. And it goes way back to not liking it and then learning to love it.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Supra Insider. This is a conversation I've been really excited to have because the number one thing people ask me about after taking my product sense and analytical thinking course is, do you have any resources for leadership and drive interviews? At a lot of other companies, these are called behavioral interviews. And I have been trying to find more and more good resources for those to link people to. And Robert Hamilton, who's our guest today, is one of those resources. Robert is an executive coach for PMs and product leaders. He spent years at Meta, working on Oculus, Facebook, and he's also spent almost 8 years at Google in product management. Robert's also worked in startups and just gets a ton of satisfaction and meaning out of coaching people on storytelling and structuring behavioral interview responses. He also does product sense and analytical thinking coaching that I do, but he loves to go deep on some of the stuff that I don't cover. So in this conversation, we went really deep on what makes behavioral interviews so powerful and tricky for both candidates and interviewers. We covered some practical tips for how to structure compelling stories using Robert's modified STAR framework. So he adds a couple more letters to it, which we'll cover. And what kind of pitfalls candidates fall into when walking through their stories in these kind of structured interviews, and why it's so critical to be authentic and bring vulnerability into storytelling. Whether you're preparing for interviews for a leadership role, product management, or any other function really, and you want to tell your story better, I think this conversation is going to be extremely helpful. Without further ado, let's dive into this conversation with Robert Hamilton. Thanks. If you enjoy this conversation, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcasting app, follow us on Substack, give us a rating. It'll help us a ton and help future people discover us while also making sure you never miss an episode. Thank you. All right, we're live. Robert, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you both. Great to see you today.
Good to see you, Robert. Good to see you, Ben.
Yeah, this is going to be a fun one, or at least one I've been really looking forward to. Some context for what got me excited about this conversation is that I teach a course that's focused on product sense and analytical thinking interviews. And those are, I think people consider them like case style interviews that are happening at places like Meta and a lot of other companies. And when I talk to my students and the folks that I work with on basically what else could I do to be helpful to you, or what are the biggest gaps in kind of like my syllabus or my curriculum that could be helpful, behavioral interviews, and specifically at companies like Meta, leadership and drive interviews are the number one thing that I'm hearing from my students that they want more materials about. And when I double click into it, I realize there's like a big gap in the market for good content that really resonates for people. So there's a craving for more of it. In this conversation, I think we have an opportunity to go deep on behavioral interviews and to create something that's going to be extremely helpful for the people that I've been talking to and a lot of other people in the market. So
great way to
I'm really excited about that. Yeah, no, not to hype you up, but you do stand out to me as one of the limited number of coaches that I've worked with so far, at least who I've partnered with, who have a very compelling way of explaining a lot of behavioral interviewing that resonates for me. And I've talked to some people that don't. Like so anyways, I'm really excited to have you here. And I think my first question for you, just to get things rolling, is what gets you excited about behavioral interviews and why are you spending a lot of time there? I know you do other things too, not just behavioral interviews, but what gets you excited about those in particular?
Yeah, the thing about behavioral interviews, and I'm over feeling uncomfortable about being interested in them. So initially it was like, really? You're into that? And it's like, well, actually, yes, I am. And I'm prepared to talk about it. So it's kind of why I'm here, I guess. When I was at Meta, when I joined Meta, I had a realization about behavioral interviews. So as you said, Ben, the Meta behavioral interview is leadership and drive. And when I did the training for that, it felt quite uncomfortable because a lot of the leadership and drive questions are pushing people about times they struggled, times when they couldn't make things work, really challenging situations. And it really feels almost like you're picking on the person in the interview. And I wasn't really comfortable. The first few L&D interviews I did, and obviously I'd passed an L&D loop because I had to do one to get hired at Meta. But the first few, I was really uncomfortable. But then actually, I got to enjoy it more than the case interviews, the domain interviews, as we sometimes call them, that you were talking about, because every behavioral interview is so different. As an interviewer, you have to really listen intently because, being honest, and I don't think this is a big secret, if I ask somebody how they'd improve Google Maps, I can sit on 20% brain power and listen and know whether their answer is any good because I've heard dozens, possibly hundreds of answers to that question, and I'll be able to tell. But when somebody's telling me their story about a time when they struggled to convince leadership of an idea, or they couldn't create a successful partnership with a key colleague, anything like that, I really have to listen intently because it's their story, it's unique to them. And then, so that's one part of it, is that as an interviewer, you have to be more engaged. And then the second reason why, as an interviewer, the interviews are interesting and why I've got into coaching them is because, again, when I do a case interview, I pretty much know the questions I'm going to ask. In fact, I knew last week what I was going to do and how I was going to construct the interview. But with a behavioral interview, bit like this conversation, we go where it leads. And so if I get certain signals from someone's initial answers and I think, well, I'm getting a lot of empathy, they seem like a servant leader, but I'm not getting a lot of a sense of ownership, then I have to change my tack and start asking questions which lead to ownership. And of course, I'm not going to ask something like, how do you demonstrate taking ownership? Because that's just like an open goal, it's too easy. But I do have to, I think of it almost sometimes as picking a lock. I've got to pick the next tool to get me past the next lever, because by the end of the interview, it's my job to really have a deep understanding of that person, which is not that easy in 35, 40 minutes, but it really is the most challenging interview. And going from someone who was uncomfortable about them initially, it's like, I really don't want to do an L&D. I actually vastly preferred them in the end. And they are not that pleasant, even as a candidate or as an interviewer, because you are digging into tough things. And I was working with a client last week who was preparing for a Meta L&D. And I said, I'm glad you told me it was going to be 35 minutes talking about times when I failed or struggled. Because it can feel like, almost as a candidate, you're thinking, am I not allowed to be good at my job? Can we not talk about a time when I crushed it? Because I have crushed it. And the fact that you're in the room in that loop at any of the big companies means you have got a successful career as a PM. So it feels a little uncomfortable that someone's jab at the times you didn't make it work. And you think, but look at those 3 launches that I did, or look at that amazing idea that I had. And the person's like, actually, could we tell me about another struggle or another failure? So there's a lot of psychology in there. And we'll talk maybe more about why companies use these questions and what they're looking for. It'd be good to get into that. But that's my origin story, if I can use that phrase. And it goes way back to not liking it and then learning to love it.
There's maybe to like some grounding to, have you seen most companies for product leadership roles do behavioral interviews? And do they call them behavioral interviews? Or because I noticed, like, for example, like Meta called them leadership and drive. I guess what I'm trying to get at too is like, how do you know if you're about to get into a behavioral interview? And then also, like, how do you get signal before you do that interview of what are the attributes or the value that those companies look for? Because it sounds like Meta, for example, they were looking for maybe like growth mindset and ownership and leadership.
I think those attributes are mostly the same. They might be a little bit different in some organizations, but I think they're mostly the same for PMs. And Meta, one of the good things about Meta's interview process is it is very honest and rigorous. So you are not going to get a behavioral question during your product sense interviews, and you're not going to get an analytical question in your behavioral interview. So they're very disciplined about what questions come where. But other companies may just go behavioral on you at any point. So I think it's a great question, Mark, to say, how do I know? And maybe we can talk about some of the pitfalls of behavioral questions. And we're kind of diving straight into the detail, but I guess it goes where it goes. Like I said, here's an example of when people don't spot that it's a behavioral question. So if you get asked, tell me about a time when you rallied people around an idea. That is not a question about an idea. The question, tell me about an idea you rallied people around, is about an idea. Now, lots of people might say, oh, you're splitting hairs. Yeah, I'm a product manager. That's my job, is to spot small differences and spot trade-offs, right? So I'm a former product manager. I'm clean now. I'm out. But the
Wait, and actually, can I ask a quick follow-up there?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Because the distinction that you've made is very subtle, right? And I think let's say I'm a little bit nervous in the interview and I miss that subtlety, but you have an inkling of, hey, there might be two things that's in here. Is it fair to ask the question back to the interviewer? Hey, are you
Of
more
course.
interested in the idea, or are you more
Yeah,
interested in like how I got the team excited about the idea?
exactly. How you show up, how you got the team excited. And you saw that. And it is subtle. And I use that deliberately because it is very subtle. And people are like, they're the same thing. They're not, because mostly the interviewer, if they say, tell me about a complex technical project you worked on, that's probably a technical question. They're interested in the project and the problem that you solved. But when it mentions people, when it mentions persuasion, when it mentions those softer aspects of things, again, if someone said, tell me about the biggest growth product you worked on or growth project you worked on, they probably do want to hear about your growth tactics. But you can ask, and you should always ask, and I think particularly for senior candidates feeling comfortable saying, I can tell you the nuts and bolts of what we did. Would you also like me to talk about my contribution? And that's where, again, if you only talk about the project, I sometimes call this handover mode, where I learned so much about the project or the problem that the team was solving that I feel I could go and run the stand-up for the team tomorrow. And I'm like, no, I don't want to know about your project. I want to know about you. And so it is a great question, Mark. You do need to ask, and again, try and balance that. And one thing that I recommend folks do in all interviews is whenever you think you've finished a little section, and we'll talk about STAR and some other stuff I'm sure at some point today, when you think you've introduced the project, say, would you like more detail on the project background before I go on to talk about what I did? And that gives the interviewer the opportunity, if they do want more project detail, to say, yeah, how many people were on the team? How long did the project take? Who were the stakeholders you had to get buy-in for? That's a sign that they want more what you worked on rather than how you worked on it. And I always recommend that, because when an interviewer usually goes and looks at their notes, sometimes a day later, sometimes a couple of days later, if they look at their notes and think, oh, they didn't give me much project detail, then it's too late. The call ended 2 days ago. They're going to write up their notes for the hiring committee or whatever their process is, and you've lost your chance. Whereas if you say, I can give you more technical detail if you'd like, otherwise I'm going to talk about my contribution. That way you are taking out insurance, as I call it. It's like an insurance policy with the interviewer. Because time management is your job in all interviews. You have to make sure you're getting to the end, but you also want to make sure that you are giving the interviewer what they want. So there are many ways to phrase that. You can say, I can get into this in more detail. Would you like to hear more about? Is there part of this I can explain in more depth? You can practice that over and over. And it's just a great way of saying, I feel like I'm done. If you don't agree, I can keep going, because we want PMs who demonstrate a mastery of the detail with an ability to cover the ground. And those two things are in tension, right? We have to feel like you could talk in absolute, very specific, intimate details of the problem or the project, but we also want the discipline that in a few minutes' time, you'll have got to the end of your answer. And those two things are in tension for most people. Most people will either be too brief or too long, and that's why you've got to practice.
I would say the same applies to the product sense and analytical thinking, right? It's like we want people who can pace themselves well to cover all the ground in those structured case style interviews and check in with you to make sure you're getting the signal you need before they keep going. And it sounds like you're generally coaching something similar for like the leadership and drive interviews.
Absolutely. I think, say, in product sense, we used to say at Google, when you were interviewing for product designers, was you want to get the feeling that this person could talk about this problem all day. That they have so much intellectual curiosity and passion, even if it's something they've never worked on. Probably it is something they never worked on, that, oh, wow, this is interesting. I could talk about it all day. However, I'm going to be disciplined and deliver an answer in 20 minutes. And that to me sums up the tension in both. It's more true in product sense than in analytical, but it's definitely true, Ben. And I think as you coach it for those disciplines, it's equally valid.
Coming back to leadership and drive. So if I tell people usually a 45-minute product sense interview is going to cover one product or one question, and then analytical thinking, you're going to probably cover one product with a trade-off question about that same product at the end. When an interviewer at a company like Meta is approaching a leadership and drive interview, in your experience, how many questions will typically come up in call it like a 45-minute slot?
I would say probably 5 or 6. So, you're looking at, and one of the things in leadership and drive, the follow-up questions are the real questions. So once I've asked that, When did you struggle to build a partnership? And you tell me a little bit, then where I go and say, what was the hardest part about that for you? Or what do you think the other person felt about that situation? The follow-up questions is where I get the real signal, because I probably know that the candidate has at least thought about the first part. And then I get my chance to push them around a little bit, not to trap them or trick them, but just to see, have you just rehearsed a good answer, or have you actually got a perspective on this? So that's why the questions go probably, if we do the maths, that suggests they're just over 5 minutes long, maybe 5.5, maybe 6 minutes, because there's the initial kind of opening rally and then there's the follow-up questions. And of course, they're not equally balanced. So you might end up on one that contains a lot of detail, but usually it's of that order. I would say 4, 5 or 6. 4 would seem, I would be very impressed by an L&D interviewer who could get the full palette of behaviors from 4 questions. There's a challenge thrown out there, partly because it totally depends on how the candidate reacts. Because if there were 4 magic questions, we would know them and we would use them, right? So it's like, that would be known. So as I say, I would go back to it. It needs a few questions.
I'm curious. So it sounds like it's obviously important to have that initial story well prepared, right? So you're able to cover all the grounds and really share the behaviors that question wants to get signal on. But I'm curious, what can you do as a candidate to like really also make sure there's depth on that follow-up question, right? What are some things you can do to prepare to make sure that you can anticipate all the potential options, or at least like 80% of the options that might come up as a follow-up?
And this might be a good chance to also hear your thoughts on STAR, because I know STAR might start to fit into some of this. So feel free to go where you want with that.
So STAR, for those who haven't been tortured by Amazon in an interview prep loop, is a situation, task, actions, and results. And normally, and STAR is well understood, so there's plenty of places you can read about STAR. A couple of quick comments on it. The S should be as short as possible. And this is the piece you're talking about, Mark, the kind of the before bit, the bit that you know. And I know your question is about what happens after STAR, but I want to talk quickly about STAR and then come to your question. S is a situation. And again, you're not handing over the project to me. You should give us as little detail as you can in order for the rest of the story to make sense. And I think we'll talk a bit more about storytelling and storytelling tactics, perhaps, because I'd love to get into that and hear your thoughts. And I have some questions for you as well today, but on thoughts on that. And then T is the task. Ideally, it's self-initiated. So it's like, based on the situation, I realized I was going to have to go and get extra resources, go and get help. Or so it's something that you derived. That's much better than when it's delegated to you. So my boss asked me to do this is a weaker T than I observed this, and so I concluded that I should do this. So the best T's are self-initiated. A is the actions. A is what you did in order to enact the T. So how did I get extra help? How did I get resources? And then the R is the result. What happened as a result of my efforts? So that's STAR in a nutshell. I like to add 2 letters, which messes up the acronym, but it helps with being a stronger candidate. So I had an L and a U, and the L is for learning. So you can weave this in if you like, and some people's storytelling method, it makes it easier for them to weave it in than others. It doesn't have to come neatly packaged at the end. But L is what I learned through this process, because one of you mentioned growth mindset and so on earlier. Like if it was a difficult situation, or even if it was a big win for you and it wasn't so difficult, what did you learn? And talking about that and saying, I realized that if you're going to escalating early is probably a good thing. Don't wait. Don't hope things are going to get better. That might be an example of the learning. Now let's look at upgrade. Upgrade is what you've changed about how you work as a PM because of that learning. So let's say that I learned that escalating quickly is a good thing. Now, whenever I feel like I might want to escalate, I ask myself, is there any reason to wait? Is there anything positive which might mean I can wait before I escalate this situation? And I always ask myself that. So that's how I've upgraded my system. Because of that learning about escalating quickly, I have upgraded my operating system. That's why I use the word upgrade. Because we all learn things all the time and we don't apply them systematically. And this is part of having a growth mindset, is looking for ways to grow and then actually achieving the growth. The growth doesn't come from identifying the opportunity for growth, unfortunately. That's like buying the gym membership, right? You still got to turn up. So the learning is the gym membership. Going to the gym is the upgrade. It's what am I doing differently as a result of what I learned. And that piece is where you get into the depth. That is like how you've changed, what you do differently. And sometimes there isn't something you would do differently. If you think something went well, it is okay to say, actually, you know what? I think that was pretty good. I would do the same again in the same situation. If you say that every single time, it's not going to go well. I had a candidate, I can say they were at Meta, it doesn't matter. I spent 40 minutes trying to get them to tell me about a situation that hadn't gone well. And every answer was, I always find a way, or, you know what, I'll get it done, whatever, or I'm actually really good at this, so I've never struggled with it. And the chances of them ever seeing this are fairly low. But A, they're not big on self-awareness, so it's unlikely they would recognize themselves. I know from having spent 40 minutes trying to get them to admit to a problem or a mistake, and they just couldn't see that that's what I wanted. They were just desperate to prove that I'm an amazing PM, I've never made a mistake. And unfortunately, that's just not plausible. But bringing in the learning and the upgrade is the reflection. And that's usually where we're going with our follow-up questions.
And that's a quick question there too. And so I think you bring a good point about that candidate that basically like, it sounds like their situation could be complicated, but it sounds like that R was always like a big win, right? And then there was maybe, the results, sorry. And then the learning was like, oh, I should just keep doing the same and I'm the best. So like, I'm already like fully, actualized, enlightened. So maybe I don't have to change. But it sounds like that might not be the way to go for these interviews. There should be like a balance of results that are great, but maybe results that were big failures. Is that accurate? Like having like a balance of R's, of wins and losses?
You don't have to contrive losses, but you also don't have to have a Hollywood ending for everything. Often, a failure story is actually a success story with the end cut off. So if you don't quite get to the successful part, then it looks like a failure. Just like, which is kind of how Hollywood works. So you could end the movie 5 minutes early before everything's gone well. Again, don't look for failure, but even in the big R's, if you call them that, the big wins, there should be some self-reflection. I could have done this earlier. I could have got that partner involved in a different way and the project would have gone better. Like it is unlikely, given that in innovative companies, we're always solving new problems, taking on things people haven't done before. It's just unlikely that you never put a foot wrong and that you can't find a way to get better. And so, and you're always dealing with different people. And that I think is in the nature of behavioral interviews. And it's something that it didn't come up in interviewing at Google, but there was a phrase that we used to use at Google: computers are easy, people are hard. And the reflection there is that technical problems get solved. That if the answer or if the problem can be solved by writing code, somebody will write the code and the problem will go away. But the interesting problems, the ones that come up in behavioral interviews, are around people: trust, fear, anger. When people start to talk about these things, my team was nervous because their previous project had been shut down. So I realized I was going to have to really boost their confidence to give them the feeling that they could succeed, because last time round they'd had a bit of a failure. There's so many situations where people have perspectives. Oh, Amanda and Karthik disagree over what architecture we should use. And it's harming, sorry, I was trying to say hurting and harming in one word. It is hurting the team because we don't have a single vision at the top. So the fact that these two people are disagreeing is holding the team back. So again, as a product manager, you've got to put your team's success as your ultimate goal. So you don't have to talk about successes, and I wouldn't say people should be looking for failure, but a lot of the questions will be directed at struggles. And in Meta's case, there are two closely aligned reasons for that. We want to see how you grow through difficult circumstances, because that is typically where most growth occurs. We also want to understand your attitude to risk, because if you are not operating outside your comfort zone, you're probably not pushing hard enough and you're probably not going to be a great fit for Meta. You've got to think, I've never done this before and I'm doing it anyway, or I don't know how to do this, I'm going to try. And that's often where the failure comes from, is I'd never done it before and my first swing was a terrible miss. And here's what I learned. And then I took a few more swings and I'm still not great at it, but I'm still in there, I'm still batting. And that's why we ask about the dark times. It's not because we want to make you feel miserable for 40 minutes. That is definitely not the intent. It's that it's those two things that often the best learnings come from there. And we want people who grow from adversity rather than shrink from it. And we also want people who take on challenges rather than thinking that looks a bit hard, I'll just stay where I am. And again, I think once you understand that, and the web has thousands of examples of how to do this, of how to convince interviewers in the technical interviews, and very few good ones on the behavioral side, because it's not so easy to relate to. Somebody else's story about when they couldn't establish trust with another team, you look at it and think, yeah, okay, but what about my story? It doesn't help you necessarily to watch examples, I think. But that's why it's great to be talking about it.
And this is one of the things that I think has made it it's one of the reasons I keep kicking the can on trying to formalize these kind of interviews into a course or some kind of like framework, is because I do feel like there's so much that is personal and there's so much that is hard to generalize. How would you design a parking solution for Google Maps, like you said? When we think about, and if we stay with Meta for a second, because I know a lot of the people that listen to this are probably thinking about Meta, or at least if I send them to this episode, they will be. When we think about the key dimensions that the interviewer is looking to get signal on in a leadership and drive interview. So the first question, which is just a quick one to make sure I'm following. In your mind, is there generally a mapping between those kind of 5 questions that we talked about in the beginning, the 5 high-level questions, 5 or 6 questions, and the evaluation dimension? So like something like 1 question per dimension is generally how you recommend people have a story ready for each type of question they might get asked?
Yes. So at least 1 story for ownership, servant leadership, scrappiness, being a convincing communicator, all of those things. And let's talk about the nature of stories. I have an analogy that I like to use here, which is to think about your story or the situation behind your story, actually. Think about that launch or that integration or some other project that you worked on. Think of that like a movie. And then your answers are like a trailer for that movie. They don't contain the whole movie. They contain a carefully curated subset to demonstrate a particular aspect of the movie. So there's the trailer that has all the explosions in it. Then there's the trailer that makes it look really tense. Then there's the trailer that makes it look beautiful for people who really love, beautiful looking movies. It's the same movie, but you select different aspects of it to demonstrate a different side of it. And you can think of it the same way with your stories. So you may have a launch that you worked on, or as I say, whatever your story is. And someone might say, tell me about a situation where you had to manage a complex set of stakeholders. You can tell that launch story with a stakeholder perspective. So you would be talking more about the stakeholders than about your teams, or you having to adapt the way you work, or your team having to change its working style, or you needing to communicate differently to have success. Then you might get asked, when have you had to change the way you communicate to be successful? And you can say, I can talk about it in the context of that project I just talked about. Would that be okay? Interviewers don't want to hear the same story over and over again, but if there's a significantly different aspect, they can do that. So to answer your question, Ben, yes, you should ideally have at least 1 story that maps to each of the things, but you should also think about other things, that other ways that story could be used. So and my other analogy for those, if the movie trailer one doesn't stick, is think of the situation as a cube, and you can rotate whichever face of the cube is most appropriate to face the interviewer. So I'm going to tell that story from a trust perspective. I'm going to tell this story from a managing stakeholders perspective. And that, I think, helps people to get the most out of their backstories, and also to keep it fresh. If you always tell the same detail about a given situation and you practice, it will end up feeling a little bit like you're playing a little movie clip, like a Loom video, rather than actually being live in the interview. But you definitely shouldn't have 1 story which you attempt to backflip into whatever position it needs to be in. That's a recipe for failure. But you can use a story for more than one end. Each story is like a Swiss Army knife. There's yet another analogy thrown in now that I have to keep track of. But each story is not like a razor blade. It is like a Swiss Army knife. There we go. New analogy christened here live.
Boom. That's a win right there. So it sounds like it might be a good idea to maybe have 5 different stories and situations, but also like it's a good exercise that for each story, almost a little bit like a fractal, like then you can break down that story to show like elements of the 5 different things that maybe a company's looking. In the case of Meta, it might be ownership, scrappiness, servant leadership and communication styles, basically. And it sounds like it's a good exercise also for you to make sure that you have the necessary depth on each situation and story, and all the details that in case there's a follow-up, you can go deep there as well.
Yeah, and I often, when I'm working with candidates, that they tend to choose their stories from working with design and engineering and maybe data science, because those are the folks that they work with most regularly. But your best stories can also come from other places. So it might be legal or privacy or ops, compliance or partnerships. There's sales. There's all of the people that we interface with as PMs. They can be good sources of stories too. It doesn't have to be a design or an engineering story. And the other thing about that is if you bring in those examples, you get cross-functional leadership and cross-functional collaboration for free as one of your attributes, rather than somebody having to say, tell me about a project where you had to work with a wide range of other functions. Somebody doesn't have to go there because you went there in one of your stories. I'd love to hear, because I love to think about failure cases, because I like to explain to my clients, like, here's what a bad answer looks like, so you know what to avoid. Because in behavioral topics, there are, just like in all PM topics, right? There's no right answer. There are strong answers and there are weak answers and there are really bad answers. What do you think are some either bad questions, bad behavioral questions, because there are those? What makes a weak behavioral answer in your eyes, guys?
I think for me, if there's no beginning, middle, and end, like if there's not a basic arc of a story to the answer, I think that generally feels like it's weaker. Mark?
Yeah, I think that the questions that I think a little bit silly in the behavior is tell me about like your biggest weakness or something like that, just like very big. And then basically, I think especially when the signal that interviewers are trying to get is, can this person turn their weakness into a strength, basically? And I think that's when I've been like, okay, like what are you really trying to get here? Yeah, curious to get your reaction to that.
I think the reason that question is so common, what's your biggest weakness, is because I think it's trying to understand someone's self-awareness and how they identify what their areas of growth are, and then how seriously they take working on those areas, and how they measure progress on improving themselves or upgrading themselves based on those areas of progress. But what I think can be tricky is, what's hard, I think, as candidates is, if they're going to ask you what's your biggest weakness, they're not asking you about a year ago, what was your biggest weakness? They're asking you right now, what's your biggest weakness? And that can feel very raw as someone to share, because you're technically going to still be working on it. So it can be a little challenging to bring it to conclusion.
Yeah. Maybe let me add a little bit more color also why I think I used to actually have a similar situation that was like good for self-awareness, but I actually like a change in philosophy that I had in the last year is that sometimes I wonder how productive is to focus on your weakness. Because a lot of times I feel like your weakness is a shadow of your superpower. So it's almost like, to me, like if someone is really good at something, I'd rather than put all their energy into their superpower as opposed to trying to fix their weakness. Except when their weakness is actually like harming and debilitating, and it's not like meeting that threshold almost. But maybe that should be my answer for that question, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think a better version of the weakness question is, what's an aspect of your work that you're looking to improve right now? That is less of a kind, because it may be because of a weakness, it may be because of something, whatever. But I think that can be a better question. And again, some people might say it's actually the same question, but you may not be doing something to address your weakness. And actually, to your point, Mark, that might be the right answer. Is I'm no good at that, so I'm outsourcing it, or I'm avoiding it, or whatever. And the superpower shadow thing is fascinating to me, because I actually think most people have practiced and the superpower as weakness to me is contextual, right? It's like normally that superpower is amazing. However, in certain circumstances, it becomes a weakness. It becomes a very bad weakness. And I think when people have practiced their superpower and they have something like, I'm incredibly detail oriented, and they think that has no downside ever. Like, when would it possibly be bad to be detail oriented? And in my capacity as an experienced interviewer, like when we're kind of brainstorming and just kind of ideas are nascent and we want to just keep all options open, rather than have someone saying, that won't work because of this, or we tried, we don't need detail right now. We need actual soft focus and a little bit more playfulness. So you, Ms. Detail, can wait outside, right, while we do this. And that's an example of where some people think they've got this bulletproof superpower that can't ever be a weakness. I would pretty much challenge anyone. If we had an AMA after this, it's what we should do. We should get people to throw out their superpowers where they think, I can't find a weakness. And I think I'll win. I say that in full confidence because we don't have an AMA after this. But I think thinking about your weaknesses, a really good question, which I've seen, again, talk about kind of when it fails. And I do want to hear more bad questions from both of you, or I'd like to, is what was some feedback that was hard for you to hear, and what did you do with it? And the best answers to that, it is something kind of existential, that it's like, ooh, that did not feel good. You know, like a PM being told, you're not supporting your team. Oh, wow. That's what I thought I was really good at. Not your bi-weekly notes aren't detailed enough. That's not.
I think it's something that gets to the essence of your, almost like your sense of identity as a person comes under like something you define yourself at. Like, for example, if I define myself as someone very inclusive and collaborative, and then I get a piece of feedback from someone who I thought I was bringing along for the ride and felt really included as a member of my team, and they sat me down, they're like, I've been losing sleep over this, but I just don't feel like I have a say in where the team's going anymore. I didn't know how to talk to you about it, but I'm really not aligned with the direction. That can be very destabilizing and force someone to grapple with their fundamental identity as a collaborator, as a PM, right?
Yeah.
And I think the only thing I was going to say, like back to bad answers for all these questions. I think the one attribute that I'm thinking about, what would make this a bad answer is lack of authenticity. When you feel like, hey, this person, like you don't really, like all those things are things that are very existential and almost like you have to be vulnerable. And if there's no authenticity, then you know that either one is like maybe not deeply rooted and not that personal or intimate, right? And then at that point, it's okay, like that just, there's something wrong here. I just asked you a very personal or difficult question, and you're almost kind of like performing a beautiful concert, smiling. Like that feels a little bit odd.
Yeah, if it's superficial, exactly. Yeah.
I think being reflective or being introspective, I think those qualities are like, do we want to work with someone who's not like that? Like just in general, right? If I was designing a interview process and it didn't at all filter out people who lack self-awareness or didn't lack reflective muscles, or were not trying to make themselves better on a somewhat regular basis and realizing that there's going to be some risk, I feel like that wouldn't be a good interview process. So I think the intentions are there. I think what this goes back to in our previous conversation, Robert, in case you didn't hear it yet, we just published it like a week ago, but we talked with Josh Herzig Marks and Mike Curdy about how unskilled so many interviewers are, and how even if the rubric is the right rubric and the intentions are the right intentions, people can show up in the interviews and have an interviewer who's really not skilled in finding the signal and asking the right questions. So I'm curious if you have thoughts on, what do you think, like what, based on your just assessment of the state of behavioral interviews or leadership and drive interviews, like what is the biggest reason you think interviewers are not getting the signal from the interviews? Are they being too rigid with the questions, or what do you think's going on there?
And I agree. I see this happen a lot, that interviewers are almost tone deaf. I think they haven't got inside the questions. They've looked at the questions that top companies use, and those are the questions you ask in order to hire world-class PMs. And that is a bit like saying, if you pick up that guitar, you'll play like Prince. Insert age-appropriate guitar player reference for people in the audience who can't remember Prince. Sorry. But it's like you using that instrument does not guarantee the same success as a very skilled or experienced interviewer. So I think interviewers thinking like, oh, we've copied a world-class process, so we're done. We will get world-class results. I don't think that's the case. I think you have to understand what's behind the questions. And again, we're talking in more detail today than I've seen lots of places talk about behavioral topics. That, like, if I would like to think that a lot of interviewers might hear this conversation and think, oh, that's what I'm supposed to do. That's what I'm looking for. I don't just ask the same questions each time and write down what they said, because that won't, I'll think, oh, I didn't really get any sense of empathy. Well, did you try? And again, knowing what you're looking for, it is not enough that you went in and asked a list of questions and came away with the responses. It's, did you use the questions? It's just like being a journalist or a talk show host. And a talk show host, not in a kind of like late night.
What's really funny is that the analogy that Mike used was exactly, you want to be an investigative journalist or Oprah, which are the two,
there you go.
the two versions you just used.
I did. And actually, I confess, I haven't watched the show yet, but I have read the transcript. So the investigative journalist term will have been pre-populated by that show. Yeah, I think you have to go in there knowing what you're looking for and be prepared to work to get it. And it is work. I think interviewing is something that most companies set a high value on, but don't necessarily give people the resources and the support to do a good job. And that's a shame, because they will not get the results they want from the people they hire if their process is broken. But I think, what are your thoughts on why it doesn't work? I'd love to hear, because you talk to lots of also, I mean, you both talk to hiring managers and other people on the other side of the fence, but how are they feeling about this?
When I think about this and look back at previous experiences that I've had as the candidate and also as an interviewer, I think the worst interviews that I've had is when I feel someone is just getting through the motions without actually like being present. They're more worried about hitting all the questions and checking all the boxes as opposed to getting sucked into the story and being present. And what is really funny, I was just reflecting, is that this is very similar to the journey that Ben and I have been for the podcast. When we started in the podcast, we had this pressure of, hey, we have a set of 10 questions that we need to ask. And we were just not present in the conversation. We like, a guest would take us to like a super fascinating rabbit hole that there was way more to unpack, but we were just so obsessed about, okay, next question. And we probably missed a lot of value that we could have delivered for our audience, but also for ourselves. I think that we could have learned a lot more about that candidate by going deeper. So I think if I'm going to put it back, it's like you just have to learn how to be present and how to be curious and how to like, because otherwise you just don't miss those subtleties, that those invitations or those like little forks that you're like, ooh, there's something here or an interesting thread to pull on. So I think that to me is the main one. And I think what I would love to maybe go next in the conversation is like, how do you train someone for a behavioral interview? Because it's like a very different, right? Like for this product analytical or product sense or analytical interviews, there's a very clear, almost like framework to follow. But for this one, it's like you almost have to teach people how to be present. And I think that's something that's very hard to teach. We can get to at some point, but I'm curious to hear Ben what he has to think there.
Yeah, I was gonna piggyback on what you said, and then maybe that can segue into the question you just asked. But I think, so if we compare the example you just gave with this podcast, we don't have to report on Robert's performance to anyone after this. It's not like we need to debrief on, would we hire Robert to do something for us based on this conversation? And we don't have to get into a room and defend our rating or something. So I think that's one big difference with interviews, is like the person who interviews you is essentially being tasked with a job. And their job is to be the agent of the company that is evaluating a candidate. And the job needs to evaluate the candidate on a specific set of dimensions and a specific set of signals. So when things go well, you have a very specific set of signals in one conversation that it happens to be that the agent of the company in that conversation is skilled at sussing out those signals. And so the candidate then gets to have a conversation with someone who's skilled to get the signals out of them. And if all goes well, if it's not a good fit, it's not a good fit, but it won't be because of the skill of the interviewer or because it wasn't clear what the interviewer was looking to learn in that conversation. So where things go poorly and where things go wrong is if there's not clarity, and I think this is more true as you go to earlier stage companies, but when there's not clarity about what are we actually looking to learn in this conversation, like what is the signal, and then there's not confidence that the person who is conducting that interview is skilled enough to evaluate those signals and then to communicate and report back on those signals in the debrief with the team. So that to me is, I think, where things really go wrong, is when there's not that kind of alignment of clear signals, clear person to suss out those signals, and then that person's also well equipped to communicate what they learned back to the team.
Yeah, where's the 100 emoji? That is absolutely everything that you said, Ben, and I agree wholeheartedly with all of that. And at Meta, before you become an official interviewer, you have to go through a series of shadows where you shadow another interviewer, and afterwards they will say, why do you think I asked this question? What signal do you think I was looking for? What do you think of their answer? So before you ever interview, you do several shadows, and you must demonstrate empathy with the interview. So the interviewer doesn't give you any tips. After, you will observe the interview live, and then at the end, the interviewer will say, so how would you rate that candidate? Why do you say that? Why, as I said, why do you think I asked this question? Or what was your perspective? What question would you have asked? And when you have done those to the degree where a calibrated interviewer says, okay, now you can interview, then you go into a process where someone shadows your interviews and asks you why you conducted the interview the way you did. And only when they are satisfied that you understand what you were doing and did a decent job, do you get your interviewer badge, as it were, and you can go and do interviews solo. So that does require both an ability to deconstruct an interview to see why you think someone ran it that way, and to construct an interview effectively. And I think that's exactly what you were getting at, Ben, is that probably watching one will make you a really bad interviewer. You have to see several. It's not enough to just be like, oh, that's how an L&D interview goes. So I think summary of kind of what we're all driving at here is most people haven't seen or done enough behavioral interviews to have a strong perspective. And
Agreed.
I think that's what causes the challenge here.
Agreed. Another big difference, and something we talked about in the other episode we alluded to a couple episodes ago, is that the Meta process we just described is you're a product manager interviewing at Meta, and everyone that interviews you is a product manager. So you're a PM being evaluated by other PMs. And they have different signals, but they're all PMs. If we go down to the early stage startups, Series A, Series B startup, almost all of the interview processes, I think all of the interview processes I've been through and I've coached people through in those stages, and I've participated in as a employee interviewing future hires in those stages, have cross-functional interviews. So like an engineering person might ask you about, tell me about a time questions, or a marketing person or a designer, right? So I think it's also interesting how, talk about not having the right person in the right place at the right time to get the signals for the job, is like your marketing person evaluating a PM's ability to collaborate cross-functionally. How many PMs have they interviewed, right? How can a marketing person get calibrated on figuring out how good a PM is at making difficult trade-offs as a collaborative PM? I feel like those kind of situations I don't want to say I like them more or less. I think they're easier, if I'm honest, to like tell the other people the story they want to hear. But I think it's interesting to me how behavioral interviews can take so many different flavors of being asked questions by PMs, or just being asked questions by people who have never been a PM or don't even know how to evaluate a PM. Yeah.
Yeah. I think ideally for the startup one, you're in a team that ideally that marketing person or engineering person has worked with enough PMs in the previous life where they haven't done that exact same interview, but they know the behaviors that they liked when they were working with those PM teams. And maybe that's the signal that they're trying to get to, right? Like they have a mental model of this is what a good collaboration looks like between marketing and product. And that's maybe the signal that they're looking for.
It's also possible. Yeah, it's also possible that you can't, if you're hiring your first or your fifth PM, you just don't have enough PMs to have an entire interview panel that's just made up of PMs. But if you have 2,000 PMs, you're like, let's have only PMs evaluate other PMs. But I think it's interesting, Robert, don't you think that at a place like Meta, after all of the iterations of the interview process there over 20 years at this point or something, they've landed on the current configuration, which is we only have PMs interview PMs. They don't have non-PMs interview PMs.
Yes, I'm sure it's been tried. Meta is not afraid of A/B testing its own interview loops and does now and again. Yeah, other companies have gone back and forth on it. A lot of companies have a hybrid model. I think Meta is happy with the process. It gets the results Meta wants. And I don't think, I sometimes think, just reflecting on what you both said, if you have someone who has a low sample size for PMs, there's a risk that they pattern match and, oh, you're just like the other PM I worked with, and I had a good relationship with them. That may not be what your new situation requires. You may need somebody different. So that idea of you're like the one I had before and they were great is not necessarily helpful. And that's not to say that non-PMs can't evaluate PMs. I think they can. And not to suggest that PMs are some superhuman special group, right? They're not, we're not. But I do think this goes back to the point of reflecting about what you were looking for. The huddle before you interview about what you were looking for is probably more important than the huddle afterwards. What did I see? That spending time ahead of times, really understanding, why is this in the job description? Why aren't we asking for this? Really spending a bit of time up front. And unfortunately, and I was one of these people when I was interviewing as an interviewer, I have an interview in 5 minutes. Let me quickly skim the candidate's resume. And in the factory interview processes like Meta and Google and Amazon, that probably is okay. But in smaller companies, I'm not saying that you should all discuss the resume in the round. I think that can also be bad because you start to get groupthink. Oh, they haven't worked on this. And if you do that before the interview, an experienced interviewer, we are taught to interview against our biases. Oh, this person doesn't have any 0 to 1 experience. Well, let them disprove that in the interview. When have you taken an idea from the ground up? It may not be on their resume. You may have misread something on their resume. So always interview against your biases. If you think someone doesn't look very creative, give them every opportunity to be creative in the interview. Because if you go away saying they're not very creative, did you let them try? That's what interviewing against your bias is. But I do think that having that discussion, and it's hard, especially in startups and scale-ups, to carve out the time that, we're going to discuss this role and discuss what we're looking for before we go into the interview process. And that's, I guess you would call it, a calibration for that role. And that's really important. The difference with the big companies is that they have calibrated for the role across the whole organization. And they've invested hundreds or thousands of hours in that over the years. And I think smaller companies, it would be a great idea for not just to be like, who wants to be on the panel, which is often the discussion is, we've got this new candidate, who wants to interview them? But what are we looking for? And I'm sure folks try to do that, but I guess the signal that you're observing, I don't see it so much, suggests that they're not doing it effectively or they're not investing enough time.
Yeah, or I'm sure I think what happens, I've seen that happen before internally in companies that I work for, is they have someone in the panel that says, hey, I used to work at a bigger company. This worked really well for us. Let me just bring this into the company, into this process. And I think this is going to be really helpful to stay organized. And there's less questioning about, hey, actually, what are the difference between this company that you used to work with and this company that's here? And I think we had a similar conversation in that kind of episode with Josh and Mike too. But yeah, I do think that the best startups are extremely intentional about what they're looking for, right? They spend a lot of time and they know that a wrong hire in a critical role like head of product or product lead is going to be super expensive. So I think they really adopt the philosophy of hire slow, fire fast, which I think is what you want at that stage. Maybe a question for you, Robert, is so for those really, I think, companies that are really dialed in, right? And they really think about, here's what I want. And I'm sure there is some almost like universal things that you want from a PM and product leader, right? Like that ownership, scrappiness, etc. But I'm sure there's some attributes that are more unique to that, maybe industry or space or founders, right? How can you pick up what those things might be that they're looking for, maybe in the job description or maybe in those initial calls, so you can actually have those stories ready to go when the interviews happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't read a lot of job descriptions, but I feel that cut and paste has a lot to answer for. Let's say that there's a lot of like, oh, let's use the nearest job description that we previously have and hack it around a little bit to get to, and then save a new version. So job descriptions are somewhat helpful, but I think looking at how the company talks about product, looking at the other people that they've hired, if there are other product hires, go and look at their backgrounds, think about how do the places they've come from behave, which goes back to your point, Mark, about people importing behaviors for better or worse. Read all the announcements. If it's a smaller company, there's not going to be quarterly results meetings to listen to or to get AI to summarize, but scour, look for signal everywhere you can, whether it's looking at the founders on X or on, I'm blanking on Meta's X clone, sorry. I can manage Threads. Thank you. I can manage to call Twitter X, but I can't remember what Threads is called. Just look for signal in those places, and don't be afraid to ask the recruiter. What are some key things that didn't make it to the job description that you think I should be thinking about? Arguably, they should have made it to the job description, but use all the tricks you can. There's no harm in asking a recruiter a question. Blanket or say, or ask the hiring manager. And again, I think every format is different, right? Sometimes people get to talk to the hiring manager first. Sometimes it's not really an interview. It's a kind of intro conversation. That can be a good place to say, what's different about being a PM here? What are almost exactly your question, Mark, is we know all of the typical things. What does a PM need to thrive here that isn't in the typical PM playbook? Why not ask the question? If, again, being like an investigative journalist, that same thing, leading questions that will get answers. And we could do a whole different podcast on good questions to hiring managers that actually get you answers that are useful to you in your decision-making process, that really, without them feeling uncomfortable. Because the last thing it's the hiring manager. You don't want them to be like, oh God, they put me on the spot and made me feel uncomfortable. That is not a good vibe. However, you can ask questions, going back to what we were talking about earlier, and not pitching for another episode, but things like, what is an aspect of your team's culture you're looking to improve? Not, what's your team's culture? Because if the hiring manager says there isn't really anything, not really a good signal, is it? That team's perfect, or I haven't found anything that I can help them with. There should be something. And learning those questions, again, like learning to ask hiring managers and recruiters and your interviewers, because again, it's different. If in a startup, you will be interviewing with people you're going to be working with. In a big tech company, often you're interviewing with people you may never speak to again after the interview, let alone work with. So asking them, why do you like working here? Well, is that really going to help you decide whether or not to take an offer? It's not actually a very helpful question. You don't know who they are. You don't know what gets them excited. Even if they're honest, the answer may not be that useful to you. So do think about really strong questions that elicit useful answers. But I think to find out those, what are they actually looking for? Yeah, look at LinkedIn, look at who else they've hired, and look at kind of everything they say and everywhere they talk about product, because these are mistakes you want to avoid. Obviously, you want to make sure that you're a good fit. And that might mean putting your hand up and saying, actually, I'm not going to be a good fit. If you find they are looking for something that you really don't have, then saying, actually, I'm going to pass is important. So don't pretend. I would be terrible in a growth role. Someone was talking to me about they were saying, oh, why don't you go for that growth role? And I said, I'm trying to think of the noun that I use. Let's say idiot. Only an idiot would hire a Google PM in a growth role. Right? Google PMs do not know anything about growth. Right? There's some amazing PMs at Google that now and then, but not growth people. It's not, Google didn't need to worry about growth. Maybe it will in the AI era, but yeah, know your limits. I am not a growth PM and would really struggle in a growth role. So if I got a sniff that somebody wanted a growth role, I would be like, you know what, here's a list of great growth PMs, or I would send them to you, Mark. So that's actually what I would do. That's actually what I would do, because you've got a more up-to-date list than I do.
Yeah, I think I'm so glad that every recruiting or hiring conversation has bubbled up this topic of just remember that an interview is a matching problem. You're trying to see, are you a good match for each other? I think a lot of times we get sucked into how can we perfect the answers to make sure that the interviewer gets the signal on us and that we get the offer. But it's also equally important for us to get the signal that we need of, hey, is this a place that I want to work at? Is this a place where I can thrive? Is it a place where they can benefit from my strengths? And the sooner you can figure those things out, I think the better for everyone. So I think just remember that when you're asking those questions, you're not only helping yourself, you're helping the company too. And I think that's just such a key point to always keep in mind as you're interviewing.
I think that's a really good place to maybe start wrapping. The thought that I want to maybe share as we're finishing, I'm curious, Robert and Mark, if you have any kind of closing thoughts before we conclude. But I think the thing that I'm sitting with is if someone's listening to this and they have some behavioral interviews scheduled coming up and they want to get ready for them, generally, I think this conversation has confirmed that one of the most helpful things they can do is to sit down and come up with, to write down a handful of stories that they are comfortable talking about in interviews that have that they have a beginning, middle, and end of some kind. So like some arch to the stories. And what I actually tell people that they can do is to create a Google Sheet. And once they figure out the specific dimensions at the company that they're interviewing at, so do some of this kind of detective work to figure out what they're going to look for in these interviews, you have almost a column per dimension that you think you're going to have to touch on at some point in the loop. And then you have a row for every story that you want to talk about. And then you could put a little X mark into every cell where you think this story should be able to touch on this dimension and this dimension, if I get the wording right. And this story should touch on this dimension and this dimension. And I think if you really want, you could have kind of your columns maybe just be the STARLU that Robert shared. And so basically end up working your way through the progression of each of those stories to touch on, to map the key action moments, maybe to some of the signals. But that's just one thing I'm thinking about as we're finishing here is if someone's listening and you want to get ready, I think just like sitting with your stories will help you be authentic. It'll help you ensure that you put yourself in a position to find the right fit in a structured way. So yeah, I'm curious what you guys maybe have as parting thoughts.
Yeah, I think what mine would be even, this advice is for even people who are happy in their role and don't plan on interviewing anytime soon. But I think one of my regrets is not having those stories written down when they were fresh, when the learnings were fresh, when the upgrades were fresh. So if you're happy in your role, start creating that story bank like today and and you have access to all those details, the artifacts, etc. Because your future self is going to be so happy that you have all those details. And also just, even if you maybe stay in that company for 10 years, I think just going through that exercise is just going to also make you a better storyteller, which is one of the most important skills as a PM. So I think I would just be like the push for anyone listening and that they just feel they don't have that story bank. And I would start this week to start collecting that.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's true. Even the stuff that you don't really admitting happened, they're like, oh, I messed this up. I got that wrong. Write that stuff down too. It's your document, right? You don't need to share it. I think there's two things I would say which actually support both of those points. Whenever one of my clients in the exec coaching business or career coaching or interview coaching talks about creating a list, I always want to think, is a short list very good or is a long list going to serve you better? Sometimes you want a very short list. Sometimes a long list doesn't hurt. And I would actually say if you end up with 9, 10, 12 stories, fine. Don't try and distill down. These are my 6 best. Keep the 12. They're not costing a lot to run. It's another row in a spreadsheet. Yes, you'll have the 5 or 6 that you think are really strong, but you never know when that one at number 9 might really help you out. So that, whenever you create a list, think, does this list need to be short or am I better served by a long list? Because if it's an aide memoir, a long list is way better. If it's a list of operating principles, a short list is way better, right? There's no hard and fast thing. We didn't get to talk about storytelling, but I wanted to add one thing. PMs love detail. We talked about detail a little bit today. When you are telling a story, detail sometimes gets in the way. So if I'm telling a story and I say, I was sitting in the living room and I heard a car pull into the drive, right? Oh, okay. Or if I was sitting in the living room and I saw a red Porsche pull into the drive. Now we've got what I think is called, is it Chekhov's gun? It's an artifact in the story that we've said. I think Chekhov says if you're going to have a gun above the fireplace in Act 1 of a play, somebody better get shot in Act 3. Otherwise, why is the gun there? So the fact that I said, oh, I saw a red Porsche, I've put that on the stack. I've said to the listener or the reader, hey, here's some detail that I want you to care about. Oh, was it the red Porsche that we saw earlier? Was it right? It's important. And I said here, I heard a car and I saw a car. So I mistold my own story there. But think about that. Just because you know the detail, sharing it doesn't necessarily make the story better. Maybe you're just giving the listener more stuff to carry. In the same thing, if you ask me to write down a number and I write 2.2, that is the same as writing 2.200000. It actually is, right? It's mathematically, it's the same. Those extra zeros don't really anything. They are correct. They are true. It's the same numerical value, but you've given the listener more to think about. So when you are thinking about your stories, even though you know all the details, don't just pile all the details out there. Think about whether they make for a better story. Otherwise, you are just introducing details that like, oh, there was a team of 100. And I'm like, oh, it must matter that this is a big team. And if that never comes out in the story, all the way through, I'm thinking, when's the other shoe going to drop? When is it going to matter that? Or, oh, we were using Java. Oh, okay, maybe that's important, maybe it's not. So do think about detail, because as PMs, we thrive on detail. It's important that we are in the details of all of our projects. But when it comes time to relate them to other people, detail may actually just get in the way. So it's something to think about. Storytelling, again, is part of this. And Mark, you mentioned you'll become a better storyteller. Again, you don't have to be interviewing to find that useful. Think about whether or not you're just showing off with detail. I know what kind of car that is. Does it really help, or is it just you showing off? And that's just one bad behavior that happens in storytelling. But yeah, what fun. Who knew we could talk about behavioral interviews for so long?
Oh, I could keep going, but yeah.
That's that big shot of espresso that you had.
No, I thought this was awesome. Thank you. And I think that maybe we could leave the storytelling deep dive as a cliffhanger for next time. But thank you so much for joining us, Robert. I think we have two more just like closing questions, quick ones. The first one is, where can our audience learn more about you and your work? And then the second question is, how can they be helpful to you?
Yeah, my website, accelerationcoach.com, is the best place to learn more about me. I mostly hang out on LinkedIn and post on LinkedIn. I know you're both very active there, so I pop up on there talking to you about things too. So those are really the two best places. If people want to get better at interviewing, they can come and work with me. If you want to read content about this, there is content on my website. But yeah, work with me, send referrals my way, send people who are interviewing. And I've got to this place by thinking a lot about this stuff. I'm always thinking about it. I'm adapting and learning all the time. So if people have perspectives to share, then yeah, come and disagree on LinkedIn. that would be great, I think. Any comments that people have, I know this podcast will be in all the usual places. I'll try and dive into the comments and the reactions there. And we'll see where we get to. But yeah, I'm very active trying to help people get better at this stuff. And I hope today we'll play a part in that.
I think we have.
I think we have. That's a wrap. Thanks, Robert.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.